It was just past 7 a.m. when the radio call came in. Unit 14, possible cardiac arrest. Orchard Pine Estates. 76-year-old female, not breathing. Meredith Evans tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She'd been a paramedic for over a decade, but every call like this still kicked her heart into overdrive. This was life or death, and every second mattered. The gated community was only a few minutes away. Trees lined the roads like they belonged in a postcard. But Meredith wasn't admiring the scenery. She was counting seconds. In her mind, she was already in the house, starting compressions, getting the oxygen mask on, saving a life. The sirens screamed through the quiet neighborhood, echoing off million-dollar homes. As they approached the stone entrance of Orchard Pine, Kyle, her EMT partner, reached over and pressed the intercom button. The gate stayed closed. He pressed again. Nothing. Meredith leaned over, her voice firm but professional. EMS, we've got a cardiac arrest. Open the gate, now. A crackling male voice came through the speaker, cold and robotic. State your clearance code. Meredith blinked. What clearance code? We're paramedics. There's a woman dying. Open the damn gate. The voice didn't flinch. No code, no entry. HOA rules. Kyle looked at her. What the hell is this? Meredith didn't answer. She grabbed her medical bag and jumped out of the ambulance, sprinting toward the pedestrian gate. Across the neatly trimmed hedges, she could see the address. 117. It was barely 50 feet away. A black ribbon hung on the mailbox, maybe from a past loss. Another was about to happen. She reached the gate. A white man stood on the other side, stocky build, black vest with HOA security printed across it. He didn't look like a cop, more like a renegade who took his job too seriously. In his right hand was a taser. His left hovered over a walkie-talkie. Meredith raised her ID. I'm a paramedic. There's a woman having a heart attack. Let me through. He didn't budge. His name tag said Brad. His eyes skimmed over her uniform, the red paramedic patch. The ambulance parked right behind her, with its emergency lights still flashing. You don't have clearance, he said flatly. Meredith's voice sharpened. Are you serious? This is an emergency. Brad stood taller. No entry without a gate code or a residence confirmation. HOA policy. I can't let you in. She stepped closer, her jaw clenched. You see the ambulance? You see my badge? I don't need clearance. I need to get to my patient. He didn't move. Call your supervisor if you've got an issue. Meredith's tone cracked. There's no time. She's coding. Move or I'm coming through. Brad raised the taser. You were warned. The click of the trigger felt louder than the sirens. A crackle of voltage ripped through the air as the taser hit her in the ribs. Her body jolted. The med bag flew from her hands. She collapsed onto the grass just outside the gate, convulsing as pain exploded in every nerve. Her ears rang. Her eyes blurred. The sound of the ambulance siren felt distant now. She tried to speak, but her voice was trapped in her throat. Brad stood over her, taser still humming. His face wasn't angry. It was blank, like he thought he'd done the right thing. Inside the house, the woman was dying, and the one person who could save her was on the ground, shaking, paralyzed, and completely helpless. Kyle's voice finally broke through the static in her ears. He was yelling through the radio, calling for the watch commander. We've got an EMT down. We need access now. But by the time anyone responded, precious minutes had passed. This was supposed to be a secure neighborhood, a safe gated community in the United States. But now, an emergency was being blocked by a man clinging to protocol instead of common sense. Meredith had responded to calls in Canada and across suburban communities in the UK during her career exchange training. Never once had she been denied entry to save a life, until now, in her own country. And somewhere behind that gate, a husband was screaming for help his wife would never receive in time. The taser hit her like lightning. Meredith's muscles locked, her vision went white, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat crashing against her ears. Her body hit the manicured grass with a thud, her med bag bursting open beside her, bandages, gloves, and a stethoscope spilled out like a crime scene. Her breaths came in short, desperate gasps. She tried to crawl, to move toward the gate, but her limbs betrayed her. Everything inside her screamed for motion, for action, but all she could do was twitch. Brad stood over her, taser still raised, his hands slightly trembling now, his face twisted between arrogance and second-guessing. "You were warned," he muttered again, like a broken record trying to justify a crime. Inside the house, just yards away, Jeanette Williams lay on the living room floor. Her lips were turning blue. Her hands clenched the fabric of her robe, and her husband Gary was down on his knees beside her, panicking. "Come on, sweetheart, stay with me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They're coming. I swear they're coming." But they weren't. He'd called 911 the moment she collapsed. Jeanette had complained of chest pain for a couple of days, but this time it hit like a freight train. Gary thought it was just another scare, until she couldn't breathe. Her eyes rolled back, her body went limp. And now, as seconds turned to minutes, he could hear the sirens right outside. But no one was coming through the front door, no medics, no help, just silence and the ticking of a clock that was running out. Kyle jumped out of the ambulance the moment he got gate override confirmation. The watch commander finally gave the go, and the system began unlocking. But it was already too late. He sprinted to Meredith, dropping to his knees. Mer, can you hear me?" She groaned, pain still rippling through her limbs. "Jeanette," she gasped. "House 117. Kyle helped her up. She leaned on him for support, her knees still weak, her hands trembling. But she refused to stop. They ran to the house together. Gary opened the door, his eyes wide with hope, only to shatter the moment he saw Meredith's face. No, he said, backing away as Meredith dropped to Jeanette's side. She checked for a pulse. Nothing. She began CPR, counting out compressions through gritted teeth. Her body was screaming from the taser, but she didn't stop. Jeanette was cold. Kyle hooked up the AED, but the flat line was unmoving. Time of death, 12 minutes after the original 911 call. Double the survivable window. Jeanette had a chance. She could have lived. And now she was zipped into a black body bag, while the man who tried to stop her rescue stood feet away behind a gate, holding a taser like it meant more than a human life. The county medical examiner confirmed what Meredith already knew: death by cardiac arrest. But unofficially, everyone knew what really killed her. Outside, neighbors began gathering, staring at the flashing lights, the yellow tape, the body bag. An HOA guard had tasered a paramedic. A woman died waiting. Whispers started, and then the footage came. A porch camera from a resident across the street had captured it all. Meredith's voice, calm but urgent. Brad's refusal. The taser firing. Meredith collapsing. It took only hours for the video to hit social media. "This is insane. She was a paramedic. HOA security tasered a black first responder. This needs to go viral." It did. By the end of the day, the footage was on news outlets across the United States. By the weekend, UK and Canadian news had picked it up too, using headlines like "Paramedic Denied Entry," "Tragedy at US Gated Community," and "Protocol Over Lives, When Safety Becomes a Threat." In every corner of the internet, people ask the same thing. How does this happen? In America? To a trained black paramedic? In front of an ambulance? Gary Williams watched it all from his dark living room, clutching a framed photo of his wife. Jeanette had been his partner for 50 years. They retired to this gated community for peace. But what they got was silence and loss. "They killed her," he whispered to himself. And with that one line, his grief turned into something else. Resolve. The video spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it had crossed over 3 million views. It wasn't just viral, it was explosive. The clip was grainy but powerful. Meredith's badge flashing, her voice pleading, the coldness in Brad's eyes, and then the sharp crackle of the taser. It was all there. The moment a paramedic was treated like a trespasser in her own country. News stations across the U.S. picked it up instantly. Georgia HOA under fire after guard tasers black EMT. The clip aired on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. A UK outlet titled it, "Emergency Blocked by Bureaucracy, Grandmother Dies Waiting." Canadian headlines read, "Paramedic Tasered at Gated Community, HOA Protocol Turns Deadly." It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a national conversation. Meredith's name was trending. So was #Justice for Jeanette. The hashtags flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. Thousands of paramedics, nurses, firefighters, and doctors from all over the US, Canada, and the UK reposted the clip. They shared their own stories of being delayed or blocked, but none like this. This was different. This was a life lost on camera. This was a system failing in real time. People weren't just angry, they were horrified. Imagine your grandma dying because someone followed a manual instead of using their brain. This is what happens when HOA guards act like cops. She saved lives, and they stopped her like she was a criminal. Residents of Orchard Pine Estates couldn't hide anymore. Reporters were camping outside the gates. News vans lined the clean curbs. Microphones were being shoved into faces. One reporter caught an older woman leaving the community. "Ma'am, were you aware of the HOA's security rules?" She hesitated. "I mean, yes, but we didn't think something like this could happen." Another neighbor was more direct. "That guard, he took it too far. But this board, they gave him the power. And now someone's dead." Back in the HOA clubhouse, chaos was unfolding behind closed doors. Board members argued in hushed tones and tight suits. Phones kept ringing. Emails kept piling up. Their so-called secure haven was now the most hated gated community in the country. Meanwhile, Meredith sat at home, arm wrapped in a sling, scrolling through her phone. Every article, every hashtag, every video. Her name, her face. But all she could feel was rage. Not for the attention, but for Jeanette. "I could have saved her," she said softly, staring at the screen. "I was right there." Kyle sat across from her, looking exhausted. "It's not your fault." "Yes, it is," she snapped, tears building in her eyes. "I should have pushed harder. I should have broken that damn gate." Kyle didn't speak. He'd been there too, helpless on the other side of bureaucracy. Watching Meredith hit the ground had broken something in him too. He leaned forward. "You almost died that day. Don't carry this like it's yours." She wiped her face. "I'm not carrying it. I'm using it." She wasn't going to let this be just another tragic headline. Toyant, Gary Williams wasn't staying silent either. A retired postal worker with no legal background, he found himself on live TV just 2 days after Jeanette's death. His voice shook, but his eyes burned with grief. "My wife didn't die because her heart gave out. She died because someone thought a taser was more important than compassion." That clip went viral too. People across the country reached out. Lawyers, advocates, first responders. Even families who had been through similar experiences. HOA survivors, they called themselves. People denied, delayed, or disrespected by power-drunk guards and unchecked neighborhood boards. One message stood out. Rebecca Stokes, a well-known civil rights attorney from Atlanta. She had a reputation for taking on big institutions and making them bleed in court. She left Gary a voicemail. "Mr. Williams, I saw what happened. I don't think this is just negligence. I think it's wrongful death. Call me back." Gary called. And just like that, a lawsuit began to take shape. Not just against Brad, but against the entire Orchard Pine HOA board. This wasn't just about one taser. This was about what happens when rules are used to control instead of protect. When people with too much authority and too little training are handed power they don't deserve. The story wasn't fading. It was growing. And Meredith knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. Gary stood in the hallway outside Rebecca Stokes' law office, clutching a file folder like it was armor. Inside were printed screenshots, HOA notices, and photos of Jeanette, laughing on their porch, holding their grandson, watering her plants in the morning sun. She should have been here. Rebecca opened the door herself. Mid-50s, sharp gray streaks in her hair, eyes that scanned like x-rays. "Mr. Williams," she said, offering her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I want to help make them pay for it." He nodded silently and followed her inside. The room was small but packed with case files, legal books, and framed newspaper articles about her past victories. She didn't waste time. "I've reviewed the footage. I've seen the news coverage. This isn't just about a security guard gone rogue," she said. "This is about a system designed to block people like your wife from getting help." Gary's hands trembled slightly as he opened his folder and pulled out years of HOA letters. Some were petty, some were warnings. One even fined them for leaving their trash bin out 10 minutes past the deadline. Jeanette had laughed at the time. "They think they run the White House," she joked. Now it wasn't funny. Rebecca flipped through the documents. They weaponized rules, and they hired someone willing to enforce them with violence. "I want the board held accountable," Gary said quietly. "All of them." "You'll get that," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm filing for wrongful death, not just against the HOA, but every individual board member who approved those access policies. We're going after the entire foundation of that system." That night, Orchard Pine Estates looked different. The lawns were still green, the houses still perfect. But something was cracked. Something invisible had shattered. Inside the boardroom, things weren't calm either. Alan Connolly, HOA president, sat at the head of the polished oak table. His jaw clenched, and the scar on his cheek twitched every time someone mentioned the word lawsuit. "We need to handle this," he muttered. One of the members, Susan, a retired accountant, spoke up first. "Handle what? We hired the guy. We wrote the rules. What's left to argue?" "Intent," said Richard, a former attorney on the board. "We never told him to tase anyone. We didn't authorize violence." Susan scoffed. "But we gave him a taser. What did we think he'd do with it? Scramble eggs?" Tension swirled. Half the board wanted to throw Brad under the bus. The other half was trying to shield themselves from liability. No one wanted to be the face of a death that had gone viral in 3 countries. But the damage had already begun. Local news had picked up Gary's press conference, and now U.S. national outlets were calling it the most egregious case of HOA overreach in decades. Even talk shows in the UK were discussing the incident under the banner, "Security versus Humanity, How a System Failed." By morning, Rebecca had filed the lawsuit. The defendants, the entire Orchard Pine HOA board. The charge, wrongful death due to obstructive emergency access policies. The complaint pulled no punches. It accused the board of fostering a militarized culture of paranoia and directly named Alan Connolly as the architect of a policy that put property protection above human lives. It also demanded $5 million in damages and punitive action that could dismantle the HOA itself. When the papers were served, Alan didn't speak. He just stared at them. And then he said, "They're coming for everything." Across town, Meredith was in physical therapy. The taser damage still made her shoulder burn when she moved it too quickly. But she pushed through it. Every stretch, every ache, it fueled her. The physical pain didn't matter as much as the flashbacks. Brad's blank stare, the sound of the taser, the moment she realized no one was coming through that gate to help her either. Kyle walked in with 2 coffees and set one beside her. They filed the suit. Meredith nodded. "Good. You going to testify?" "If Rebecca wants me to, I'll do it," she said. "People need to know what happened." "You think they'll listen?" She looked at him, eyes sharp and unwavering. "They'll have no choice." Back in Orchard Pine, residents were restless. Some sided with the board, calling it an unfortunate mistake. Others were furious, demanding accountability. Signs started appearing on lawns. "Justice for Jeanette." "HOA reform now." "Rules killed a neighbor." And inside a quiet house at the end of Maplewood Lane, Gary Williams stood at the window, watching as the community slowly began to unravel. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just whispered to himself, "It's starting." The HOA board's emergency meeting started with silence. No coffee, no small talk, no greetings. Just stiff faces around a glossy mahogany table that suddenly felt more like a courtroom than a conference room. Alan Connolly sat at the head, his posture rigid, hands clenched. Behind him, the windows offered a perfect view of the community's pristine tennis courts and artificial lake. But none of that mattered anymore. The lawsuit had turned their little gated paradise into a war zone. "We need a unified response," Alan said, his voice low. Susan, eyes puffy from stress, threw a newspaper onto the table. The headline read, "Tasered paramedic, dead grandma, and the HOA that let it happen." Unified response? It was already too late. "Do you know how many reporters have called me?" she snapped. "How many residents are threatening to stop paying dues? My neighbor screamed at me in the street yesterday." Richard, the former attorney, leaned back in his chair. "We stick to protocol. We say Brad acted on his own. We didn't instruct him to use force. But we hired him," Susan said. "We armed him. We gave him rules that never made room for emergencies. We didn't tell him to tase anyone," Alan muttered. "But we made him believe he had the right," another member added quietly. The truth hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the community wasn't waiting. Residents had started gathering in small groups, porches, sidewalks, clubhouse lawn. Some brought coffee, some brought signs, most brought questions. Linda, a retired school teacher who'd lived in Orchard Pine for 20 years, stood in front of a growing crowd near the fountain. She held up her phone, playing the taser footage on repeat. "This is what our dues paid for," she shouted. "This is what we trusted them with." Her voice cracked. "A grandmother died, and a black paramedic was treated like a criminal for trying to save her." Someone yelled from the back, "They turned this place into a damn prison." Applause erupted. Not everyone agreed. Ed, a retired police officer, raised his hand. "Listen, I don't support what happened, but we've had break-ins. The rules were meant to protect us." Linda turned to him, fire in her eyes. "From paramedics? From the people who come to save lives? Don't talk about protection when a woman is dead." The crowd chose their side. That night, the neighborhood message board crashed from traffic. Residents posted long rants, threats to call the state attorney general, and demands for the entire board to resign. Reporters circled like sharks. USA Today, BBC UK, CBC Canada. Everyone wanted a piece of the scandal. Inside her small apartment, Meredith sat quietly, watching it all unfold on her laptop. Her arm ached. The sling was gone now, but the nerve pain lingered, a sharp reminder of that morning. She scrolled past headlines. Paramedic denied entry at gated community. Black first responder tasered in line of duty. Lawsuit targets power-hungry HOA. Each headline stabbed in a different place. She closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't just pain she felt. It was humiliation and anger. The kind that settles in your bones when the people who should protect lives become the reason lives are lost. She picked up her phone and texted Kyle. "Let's visit Gary tomorrow." He replied instantly, "I'll drive." The next evening, they pulled up outside Gary's house. No gates this time, no questions. Just an open street and a man sitting on his porch in silence. Gary stood when he saw them, his eyes hollow but steady. He didn't say much, just opened the door and led them into the living room. Meredith saw Jeanette's photo on the mantel, beside a candle. She took a deep breath. "I should have saved her," she said softly. Gary didn't blink. "You tried, and you almost died trying. That means more than you know." Kyle looked down, guilt flickering across his face. "I should have been there. I was stuck at the gate. I should have jumped out." Gary shook his head. "You were doing your job. The problem wasn't you. It was the rules, and the people who wrote them." He reached for a dusty old box and opened it. Inside were years of HOA letters, warnings, fine notices, even one from last winter about a flower pot placed outside regulation perimeter. "She always said we gave them too much power," he murmured. "Now I know she was right." Meredith's voice was quiet but firm. "We're going to make sure they never forget what happened here." And as Gary nodded, the storm outside the gates grew louder. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed. On one side sat Gary Williams, flanked by attorney Rebecca Stokes and Meredith Evans, who wore her paramedic uniform like armor. On the other side, in stiff navy suits, sat the entire Orchard Pine HOA board. Their faces were pale, their eyes glued to the judge's bench like prayer might reverse what was about to happen. Reporters filled the back rows. Photographers sat crouched by the walls. Outside, protesters held signs that had become national symbols. Paramedics, not paperwork, and justice for Jeanette. Rebecca stood up and walked slowly toward the jury. "This is not a complicated case," she began, voice steady. "A woman died. A paramedic was tasered, and none of it had to happen." She pointed gently to Gary. "This man lost his wife of 50 years because a gated community decided that protocol mattered more than people. Because a board wrote rules with no room for emergencies. Because a security guard, armed and authorized, chose to enforce those rules instead of showing basic humanity." Her words landed hard. The jury, a mix of retirees, professionals, and 2 former military members, listened closely. Meredith was called first. She stood with her shoulders back, her voice calm but charged. "I arrived with lights on, sirens blaring. I told the guard, Brad, that someone inside was in cardiac arrest. I showed him my badge. I pointed to the ambulance. I begged him to open the gate." Her eyes met the jurors. "He tasered me anyway." There was no sound in the courtroom, only the clicking of the stenographer's keys in the shallow breaths of those listening. She described the pain, the electricity ripping through her body, the helplessness of lying on the ground while someone inside was dying. "I've saved dozens of lives, but that morning I couldn't even stand up," Rebecca approached. "Did anyone from the HOA board ever apologize to you?" "No," Meredith said without hesitation. "Not once." Kyle testified next. His voice cracked as he described running to Meredith's side, finding her on the grass, her med bags scattered like a war zone. And when they reached Jeanette, too late. "We train for moments like this," he said. "We know how to save lives, but we can't save anyone if we're stuck outside a gate." Then came the medical experts. They didn't dramatize. They didn't need to. A cardiologist laid it out clearly. Had CPR been started within 4 minutes, Mrs. Williams had up to a 40% chance of survival. She received none for at least 9. Gary looked down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Then Brad took the stand. He looked smaller now, no vest, no weapon, just a trembling man in a cheap suit. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. "I was following protocol," he mumbled. "They told us to deny access without clearance." Rebecca stepped forward, arms crossed. "You saw a uniformed paramedic, with an ambulance, lights flashing. You really thought she was a threat?" Brad stammered. "Who was doing my job?" "You had a taser pointed at a first responder," she said coldly. "Your job was to protect people, wasn't it?" He had no answer. Then came the board. Alan Connolly walked slowly to the stand. The scar on his cheek twitched every time Rebecca spoke. "We had rules in place to protect the neighborhood," he said. "We'd had break-ins, and we needed tighter security." Rebecca didn't blink. "Did your rules include tasering medics?" "No, that was never our intent." "But you hired Brad. You approved the rules. You gave him authority to deny access. And you never once adjusted those rules for emergency responders, did you?" Alan hesitated. "We expected guards to use common sense." Rebecca stepped closer. "Common sense doesn't survive in a fortress built on fear." She turned to the jury. "This isn't just about Brad Morton. It's about what happens when leadership confuses power with protection. When people hide behind clipboards while lives are on the line. When a paramedic is treated like a criminal for trying to do her job, and a woman dies alone on her floor because the gate stayed shut." The room was silent as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. For 2 days, the courthouse waited. Outside, media vans broadcast every second. Social media exploded with commentary. Emergency workers around the US, UK, and Canada were watching, hoping. Then the jury returned. The foreperson stood, voice steady. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Gary Williams. The Orchard Pine HOA is found liable for wrongful death due to negligent and obstructive emergency access policies. Gasps filled the room, then silence, then applause. The judgment, $4 million in damages. Gary didn't smile. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and whispered Jeanette's name. Meredith reached over and took his hand. It wasn't about the money. It was about being heard. Finally, someone had listened, hoping. Then the jury returned. The foreperson stood, voice steady. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Gary Williams. The Orchard Pine HOA is found liable for wrongful death due to negligent and obstructive emergency access policies. Gasps filled the room, then silence, then applause. The judgment, $4 million in damages. Gary didn't smile. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and whispered Jeanette's name. Meredith reached over and took his hand. It wasn't about the money. It was about being heard. Finally, someone had listened. The verdict shook Orchard Pine Estates to its core. Within 48 hours, 3 board members resigned. Alan Connolly vanished from the community entirely, his house listed for sale before the week ended. The HOA's bank account was frozen. With a $4 million judgment and more legal fees pending, the once proud fortress of suburbia was collapsing. But this wasn't just about financial fallout. Residents began to see the neighborhood with different eyes. The same gates they once praised for keeping trouble out now looked like barriers that cost someone their life. The same guard shack that once gave them a false sense of safety now symbolized control, fear, and failure. One by one, homemade signs appeared on lawns. Justice overrules. Never again. Paramedics get in first. The HOA security contract was terminated. The scanners were removed. Emergency access policies were rewritten from scratch. A direct access system for ambulances and fire services was installed, not just at Orchard Pine, but in dozens of similar communities across the U.S. and even some in Canada and the U.K., where the story had sparked policy reviews. People were watching, and they were changing. Meredith returned to work a month after the verdict. Her shoulder still throbbed some mornings. The nerve damage wasn't gone, but the fire in her spirit was stronger. Her first day back, she wore a black wristband with one word embroidered on it, Jeanette. At the end of her shift, her supervisor called her into the station. She expected a case debrief. Instead, she found a small crowd waiting, colleagues, city officials, and media with cameras rolling. They handed her a plaque that read, Meredith Evans, for unshakable courage and service in the face of injustice. She held it in both hands, then stepped up to the mic. I didn't save Jeanette, she said quietly, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life. But this isn't just about one call gone wrong. This is about what happens when systems treat rules like gospel and forget the people they're meant to protect. No one should ever have to fight through a gate to save a life. The room went silent, and then came the standing ovation. Across town, Gary Williams sat in his living room, holding a letter in his lap. It was from a young woman in Virginia, a paramedic trainee. She'd seen his interviews. She wrote about how Jeanette's story inspired her to keep going, even when training got hard. He smiled faintly, then walked to the shelf and pulled down a small photo of Jeanette, one taken on their anniversary trip to Maine, her eyes crinkled with joy, the ocean behind her. I hope you see what you started, he whispered. Then he folded the letter and placed it in a box marked Jeanette's Legacy. With part of the settlement, Gary launched the Jeanette Williams Emergency Access Scholarship, a fund for Black paramedics and EMTs across the United States, the UK, and Canada. The fund helped cover tuition, gear, and mentorship for underrepresented trainees. Within 6 months, over 40 applicants were accepted. One of them would go on to join Meredith's own EMS unit. A quiet ripple of change had begun. Back in Orchard Pine, things looked different. The new board included people like Linda and Tom, the ones who had spoken up, who refused to stay quiet when it mattered. Their first act was a public town hall with residents. There will be no more locked gates for first responders, Linda announced. There will be no more silence when someone dies. We're not just a gated community, we're a human community. The crowd clapped. Some cried. Even Clara, who once defended Brad, stood up during the quanda and apologized for her silence. I got so used to safety meaning fear. I forgot what safety really is. Looking out for each other. Meredith, standing in the back, nodded. Kyle leaned in beside her. Think they'll actually change? They already are, she said, and they were. The neighborhood began holding CPR classes, fire department ride-alongs, open gate simulations with local EMS. Kids drew thank you cards for ambulance drivers. Old men on porches waved again. And those gates? They stayed open more often now, not because the security system was gone, but because the fear that built it was finally starting to fade. Gary walked those streets every morning, hands in his coat pockets, heart still heavy but not hollow. Sometimes neighbors stopped him to talk. Sometimes they didn't know what to say, but every once in a while someone would mention Jeanette's name. And when they did, Gary smiled. Because now they remembered her not as a victim, but as the reason their neighborhood changed. The reason a country paused and looked inward. The reason a system bent and broke. And maybe, just maybe, the reason the next paramedic wouldn't have to fight through a gate to save a life.